Hi, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and I'm hanging out again today with my friend Kat. We're doing part 2 of a series on the moon, the mysteries of the moon. If you haven't checked out part 1, you can start there. We'll be building on some of the concepts in the first video today by talking about the nodes of the moon. Now, Kat's been helping me on social media for the past year, and she has sort of collected a bunch of questions that all of you have been asking, and we're doing a series of talks together where she basically stands in as someone asking the questions and helps me to articulate some answers. I also want to make sure that we just plug Kat's work. She has a really cool podcast that I like called thecreativeintrovert.com. Or it's called The Creative Introvert. You can check it out at thecreativeintrovert.com. So thanks for being here again, Kat.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Yeah, we're going to be talking about the nodes today. So this is a really big topic, but I thought we could just do a basic outline and maybe start by explaining what the nodes actually are.
Yeah, so I mean, the technical explanation of the nodes of the moon is that they are moving points along the ecliptic. And the points, the ecliptic is the zodiac, the path of the sun, and they are the moving points that show where the moon is going to be intersecting with the ecliptic as it rises up in latitude above the ecliptic line or as it descends below the ecliptic line. And as it intersects with the sun's path, the points at which it intersects, those are the nodes. One while it's going up, the ascending or north node. One as it's going down, the descending or south node. The moon is always winding its way around the sun's path like a serpent. And so those intersection points are really important because when new or full moons happen around those points within close enough proximity, we get eclipses. So the nodes are these always moving points. In Western astrology, they were understood as like mathematical or astronomical points. In ancient Indian astrology, they were understood as shadowy planets.
Okay, so how did astrologers interpret the nodes of the moon?
Sure. Well, we should start by maybe drawing a little bit of a contrast between ancient astrology and modern astrology in this regard, because most people understand the nodes of the moon through the lens of modern astrology, which is to say, a new theory about the nodes that has emerged in, say, the past 70 years. Since the 40s, 50s, especially, there was an astrologer named Dane Rudhyar who sort of started pontificating about the meaning of the nodes without having what we would say is an adequate amount of information about the classical roots of the classical roots about the nodes. So he was theorizing about the meaning of the nodes without, say, having a really deep grasp of what Indian astrologers thought and practiced about the nodes, and were still practicing about the nodes for 2,500 years, or what ancient astrologers in the West thought about the nodes. He was an innovator and a pioneer, and someone that we owe a debt of gratitude to, because he really helped to reawaken love and interest of astrology in the modern era, and helped also to marry astrology to psychology more and more. But his view of the nodes also perpetuated a whole kind of new school of astrology called evolutionary astrology, gradually growing from him, Charles Carter, and others along the way, Raymond Merriman, Stephen Forrest, Jeff Green, and now so many who practice this form of evolutionary astrology. And it's really, in many ways, built off from Rudhyar's ideas about the nodes. The basic gist of it in modern astrology is that the north node is seen as like your spiritual homework for this lifetime, and the south node is seen as maybe the past hangups that you had. Sometimes you'll hear it described as the south node is the bottle and the north node is the meeting. Like Alcoholics Anonymous at north node, south node is your drinking problem. At the same time, modern evolutionary astrologers will say that the south node is an aggregate of your past lessons, accomplishments, gifts, skills, but also maybe regressive and something that you tend to rely on. And the north node is that new thing that you need to learn how to go and do. So those are and then the whole reading of the chart, as someone, there were, like, again, like many modern evolutionary astrologers that basically said the whole chart should be based around what the nodes are saying, because they indicate the core karmic lessons that you're here to work on. So it's really, I've done like a long series on this topic before, and I address this in several classes in my year 2 program. But the gist of it is that ancient astrology did not share a similar outlook on the nodes, either practically, meaning how they read it in charts, or theoretically, meaning in terms of what they saw as the purpose of life or spirituality and how enlightenment was accomplished. So to sum it up, ancient astrologers didn't believe that there was some kind of built-in lesson in your birth chart that you're here to master on your way to like higher levels of consciousness. That wasn't how they conceptualized spiritual advancement. Like just go master this thing or get better at relationships or get better at being independent with money or get better at family life rather than career, or whatever the different built-in lessons tend to be through all the houses that the nodes are in modern evolutionary astrology. They didn't look at the chart and say that, yeah, there's some particular lesson in this chart that you're here to like go and learn and master that, and then you keep climbing a ladder or something. Wasn't part of the paradigm. That's actually a really sort of new age paradigm, and to get into that would take a while. But so that's the philosophical thing. They didn't take that view. But not only that, they also didn't agree that that's what the nodes meant practically, that the north node was associated with something that you needed to go and learn or do or become, and the south node was something that was like a baggage from the past. So first of all, does that make enough sense in terms of the modern view?
Yeah, and it just completely makes sense in terms of what the modern, like let's say the last 100 years, which is when it sounds like this theory came into being. Um, this is what we want to do. We want to solve problems and like get, like we want a simple solution to everything.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like the ancient astrologers didn't have that, like just move here, move away from there, you're done.
Yeah.
They didn't have that approach.
Yeah, exactly. And their view of, to take to spiritual life is sort of, it's like running a program that's just entirely outside of the paradigm of your birth chart in some ways in ancient astrology. It's like if you're going to take up a spiritual life, you're in a way, it's less about your birth chart and more about doing something other than karmic activities. In other words, when you take to spiritual life, let's say you take up a life that involves meditation. Well, meditation will, its effects on your psyche and your soul will bleed over into everything that you're doing in your life. But the deeper that you absorb yourself into a spiritual lifestyle of, say, meditation or prayer or chanting or whatever the spiritual practices might be, the less that you tend to get bound up in thinking that there's something I'm here to accomplish, right? So it's that accomplishment model that's very modern. Spiritual accomplishment isn't really a part of the ancient paradigm. Leveling up in lessons and all of that. So not to say that we don't learn lessons, of course we do, but it's just that the chart would not really be looked at through that lens. So anyway, but the classical view of the nodes of the moon is a little different in the West and the East, but they have a lot, they're closer in meaning than, say, either of them are to today's view. So in the West, in Hellenistic astrology, all the way through medieval astrology, the nodes of the moon, the head and tail of the dragon, are connected to eclipses, of course, and they're used in helping forecast eclipses. But they also generally have this meaning of increase and decrease in a universal sense. So the north node of the moon was associated with, say, Jupiter and increase or gain or benefit or expansion. And the south node associated with decrease, loss, diminishment, constraint, or Saturn, winter, decay, death. So the north node was generally considered slightly more benefic. And if a planet was conjoined with it, which was probably the top thing to look for, is if a planet's conjoined with the node, then that planet will be increased. So if you have a Mars that's with the north node, this actually becomes problematic, because the teaching was that it increases things for good or bad. Remember, these are the nodes of the moon, and the moon in ancient astrology was pertained to the realm of fortune, which we talked about in our first talk. The realm of fortune is just the turning wheel of circumstance, ups and downs, get money, lose money, you know what I mean? Like gain and loss. So gain at the north node for good or bad, depending on what it's with. If the north node is with, a malignant tumor, that's not good, because it'll make the malignant tumor grow. If so, in a sense, the north node can increase things for good or bad. And context is very important, and it's just an amplification point. Now, the south node of the moon is the opposite, and it's about reduction, simplification, elimination, like that, just Saturnine things. Saturn, of course, the lord of winter, death and diminishment, stuff like that. Dissolution, even with Saturn. So winter and water and the dissolution of life. So the south node will diminish things for good or bad. Now, on the outset, that sounds like it would be really malefic, like, oh, my wealth is being diminished while the south node of the moon goes through my second house. Ouch. But on the other hand, it could mean that, if you're dealing with something that's really difficult, like let's say you're dealing with a tumor again. South node's on the tumor shrinks. So the malignant thing can also go down. And this is why ancient astrologers also said the south node will diminish or decrease both the good and the bad. So they're just universal signs of increase and decrease. So why? Because the moon, when it's crossing the ascending node, is going up. So it's upward movement of fortune. Upward movement of fortune is relative. It can mean good or bad, depending on the situation. There's so many people I've seen this so many times in my practice, and not everyone is like this, but people who have the north node and the sun together, right? Modern astrology has told them, you go be yourself, right? The sun being like your ego, let's say, or your sense of self and specialness or importance in the world. I have a special destiny, the sun, right? And then put it with the north node, and that's what you got to go do. And unfortunately, in ancient astrology, like another very valid reading of the sun and north node could be someone who's a total egomaniac, right? Like just amplifies their sense of self-importance. And you'll see people like this, finding all sorts of ways to try to become famous or popular, and just ruthless in that regard. It's not
And also,
necessarily a good thing.
and wouldn't you, like, if you have that situation, and not to speak of everyone who has that, but you would love to hear be more of you because it's in your chart.
Yeah, of
Of course,
course. Yeah, like it's the funniest thing about the difference between them. I mean, I'm not trying to say, I mean, I had to make up my own choice about which system that I felt was more valid, and everyone else has to do that on their own as well. But for me, it was like, yeah, of course, everyone loves hearing about their north node, because the north node basically, for a lot of people, just amplifies things and makes them bigger and more seductive and attractive. And in that sense, it is, if you're doing a straight up comparison, you would say that in many cases, modern evolutionary astrology is simply telling people to pursue things that are about personal inflation and aggrandizement. Now that's a really kind of harsh criticism. So I'm not saying, I think that there are many evolutionary astrologers who practice very sensitively, but it is a very different perspective, and that there are tangible differences in the conclusions sometimes. The south node of the moon, decrease, diminishment, and people will often be like, oh my gosh, I've got, Saturn on the south node of the moon. Oh my gosh, and it's whatever. And then you think that they think to themselves, and, maybe in, in modern sense, that they have big Saturnine problems in their past somewhere. And actually, what it could mean is that the more difficult qualities of Saturn are actually curbed by the south node of the moon, and refined and made better. It depends on the context, but the south node of the moon's diminishment is not always a bad thing. And it just has a very different meaning than what modern astrology says. Now, in Indian astrology, are you ready for me to go into Indian astrology?
yeah, please do.
Okay. So Indian astrology is, okay, you've got the north node is called Rahu and the south node is called Ketu. Now, I work with these in my practice because I find them just very compelling in practice. I've found them to be really reliable way of looking at the nodes. It's even more different than the modern view. I'm going to simplify this because we can't do like a full talk on it or anything, but Rahu, or the north node of the moon, is the severed head of a demon who tried to steal the nectar of immortality. And so he gets his head cut off by Vishnu, and he's severed head with the nectar caught in his throat. So he is eternally hungry for that nectar that he can never assimilate or take in. So the north node of the moon literally represents that desire that drives us compulsively to seek satisfaction that is unobtainable in the material world. Like, think about what a difference that is between the modern view that would say, go do this thing.
Right. And you can also see how it fits in, because if it's that thing that you're hungry for, of course you're never going to be satisfied in it. And if you've got an astrologer telling you to continue to try to satisfy it, you're just kind of going to be
Very
caught up.
appealing. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
it's like being like, I love pizza, even though I know it's bad for me. I love pizza, and the
Eat more
astrologers,
pizza. Just go for it. Like,
you
just
really
keep
need to
eating
eat
pizza.
pizzas. Yeah, that's essentially what the difference is. So the north node of the moon is Rahu, is representative of that kind of really, we call it like a compulsive, shadowy tendency to want to consume. And it's the relentless material ambitions that we have, whether it's sex or money or fame or stature or knowledge, whatever it is. Rahu will drive us to want more of that. And when it's conjoined with the planet, especially, then it really perturbs that planet. So, for example, when you see Rahu with the sun, it's often a sign of someone who will have a mentally ill father, or they will have a father who's like a raging alcoholic, or they might have a father who's immensely successful or something like that. But also there may be something about that ambition that's pretty ruthless. And or you could say even just they're in their own ego structure, they're just relentlessly in need of attention or something like that. It's not always negative, because there is a mediation or a mitigation that ancient Indian astrologers gave, which is essentially do karma yoga. Like if you're going to be ambitious, then try to be a philanthropist. Or if you're going to be ambitious, then at least try to be ambitious in a way that does good to others. So that could mitigate a difficult Rahu. Yeah, if you have North Node with Venus, if someone in modern evolutionary astrology would say like, you need to, develop Venus more, whatever that might be. Ancient Indian astrology, North Node with Rahu would say something like, you know, be careful that you're not just attracted to like fashion and glamour or sex or something like that. There's other things too, but and whereas Ketu, the South Node of the moon, is the severed, deceased body of the demon that was liberated by the Sudarshan chakra, the weapon of time that Lord Vishnu uses to cut off the head of the demon. So Rahu's living eternally hungry with the immortal nectar stuck in his throat, whereas the deceased body attained moksha. So you get, the body that was cut off from the head, because it was killed by the Lord, it attains liberation. But the south node of the moon, in that sense, is related still to the desire for liberation. So the desire for liberation is actually not a good thing in yoga, because when someone sits down to meditate and they're like, okay, this world sucks. This world is really hard. It's really painful. And I just want to get out of here and into bliss. And so I'm going to meditate. Okay, well, like partially that's true. But also when we have ambition for spiritual life mixed with really intense aversion or the desire to escape from something, it's just a different form of selfishness. And so the south node of the moon can represent the desire to, escape, basically. So you could see the impulse of the south node associated with people who are more interested in otherworldly things or in potentially escapist things. So you can see the south node associated with heroin or meditation. You can see it associated with the impulse to spiritual life, as well as sometimes, the unhealthy impulses associated with spiritual life, like extreme asceticism or, neglect of the body or stuff like that. You'll see the south node associated with things like suicide, or disembodiment and things like that. But the south node was thought to be slightly more auspicious simply because aversion to the material world and pursuing something otherworldly is a bit more conducive to spiritual growth than it is to be caught up in relentless material ambitions.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. I do find the South Node a little bit harder to understand, so I'm just going to ask a couple of follow-up things, maybe to get a bit more clarity. So it's not always going to be pointing to, for everyone, a spiritual desire to kind of check out. It comes up. It's going to be different in all of our charts.
Mhm.
So can it also relate to, I guess, just an area of life where we want to check out? Maybe there isn't even anything um, spiritual like attached to it. It's just like, this is my escape route. This is how I escape from reality.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Okay.
Like, okay, here's an example. Do you know who Bernie Madoff is?
Yeah, I've heard
Okay,
of Bernie.
right, like big Ponzi scheme artist, right? So he had south node with Venus in his 10th house. So there's someone who doesn't want to have to do the work, right, of
Mm.
building an empire. He wants to cheat and escape having to actually do the work. So that kind of cheating, escapist tendency around fortune and money and success professionally, that's a South Node Venus in his chart. Um, if you look at, like, I have the South Node at my midheaven, right? So that's also in my career house. My career began because of 10 years worth of, ingesting psychedelic substances in the Amazon and writing a memoir about drug addiction and overcoming it with another mind altering substance, from another part of the world. And then, like, a lot of the way that I teach and so forth has been related to spirituality. So the south node of the moon, like the north node, has a mitigation, which is to override the impulse to escape or to check out in spiritual life, and to continually try to incorporate the impulse to spiritual life or otherworldliness within the world, right? So it's how can you sort of be in this world but not of it at the same time. Now, this is a lesson for the south node when it's strongly configured in a person's chart, and it might be as simple as a person just realizing I need to be sober rather than strung out, or I need to, a person may try to escape through any kinds of different things, but the underlying theme is usually a sense of dissatisfaction and longing, right? And it's the south node is trickier in a sense. Rahu, it's easier, just kind of like a hunger. I heard it explained by an astrologer one time who said, think of the north node like punk music, just like loud and kicking and screaming and, like that. And the south node is more like emo. It's like, I'm just not for this world. There's pain. It's romantic, but it's like looking for this kind of eternal bliss, and it's forlorn. And like the South Node's a bit more like that.
Yeah, okay, that's clear. Thank you for that analogy, because
Yeah.
that spoke to me. So it sounds like these are complex things. It's actually they really tell a story as well, between the two, the north and the south. So I
Mhm.
guess we
Yeah,
can't cover it all.
you could think of it like also like a kind of like a karmic river, and it's not flowing linearly. Like North Node is future, South Node is past. It doesn't necessarily work that way. The Sometimes the nodes are flowing more in one direction than the other, and they go back and forth. You could think about it like the nodes of the moon are like one of those Chinese finger traps. Remember those games? And I don't even know if they were if they were called that for some reason. It was prejudicial. I'm sorry, because I don't know the history of that, but I just remember them being called Chinese finger traps. They were these little games, and you put your fingers in them, you try to pull, and then if you pulled, they would get even more stuck. And the nodes of the moon are like that in our chart. They represent two polar opposite tendencies that we have to approaching the inherent discomfort of the wheel of karma, of samsara. That's why they're the nodes of the moon, the world of fortune. So the North Node approach to our discomfort in life is to look to, what could satisfy us, what hunger, or what kind of satiation we need, right? So the in a sense, it's like that's one way that we have of dealing with pain. On the other hand, the south node of the moon is the one that likes to check out, that likes to say, rather than face the world, I'll just lay in the couch all day and watch movies and like no ambition. It could be like that, or it could be like I'll shoot up, or I'll, you know, the south node was again considered slightly more benefic, specifically because it was more in the kinds of activities the south node of the moon likes can lead us to healthier spiritual impulses, but they still usually have to contend with some degree of like, I just want to get out of here. And if you pull in either direction, for example, it's like a diet program. People go, they eat too much, Rahu, North Node, and they think, well, the eating's not fulfilling me, and I know it's bad, and I know I shouldn't be doing it. It doesn't actually make me happy. Oh, but the hunger is so strong. South Node, well, I'll just stop eating disorder, right? And then they binge in the opposite direction and then back and forth. Or they might say, you know what, I'm just not going to eat for 10 days and I'll lose all the weight and then I'll just be moderate in how I eat. Well, that doesn't work. Then all of a sudden you're back to binge eating again. So the two tendencies to want to renounce or to want to indulge, the extremes of those. And you see them circling all the time in social media, at least I do. People go to one of two extremes when it comes to spiritual life. They get pissed off when they feel like spiritual life is too extreme or aesthetic or austere. and they go like, I'm just going to be me. It's all about embracing life. It's all about embracing the desires of the body. It's all about just embodying ourselves and like having what you want and just learning how to say yes to it all. And then, there's a picture of them at Burning Man naked on a bike or something. Right. And so that's like your North Node response, and so maybe sometimes it's necessary. I don't know. But I've never been to Burning Man. It looks like people actually do have fun at Burning Man. I have friends who go, so no offense to anyone. Anyway, so let's just say that that's the extreme response in one direction. Then the other social media response is like, I'm giving up Facebook for 30 days. I'm taking a spiritual fast. I need to get my shit together. I've lost myself. It's time to get back in line. You know what I mean? And then they get austere. And so those two things pull on us all the time. And for ancient astrologers in India, both of them were a trap. They embody one another over and over again. So again, just notice the difference philosophically, because in modern astrology, we say, oh, the South Node is the problem and the North Node is the answer. Ancient astrology, it's much more complicated than that. And actually, the answer lies somewhere in the midst of how we begin to see through the illusion that we need to or should get out of here or indulge in this place. To learn how to fly into our spiritual form requires a lightness of consciousness that is not deceived by either of those alternatives. It somehow walks through both of them without getting entangled.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. And I'm wondering now about how the nodes, because they stay in what a certain axis or two signs for what, a year and a half.
Yeah, like a year and a half or so. They move through the signs, and they change signs together. They're always at exactly opposite points in the zodiac. So if the North Node is at 15 Cancer, the South Node will be at 15 Capricorn. So they're always opposite. They're always moving retrograde or backward through the order of signs. There are two different ways of measuring them: the mean versus true node. That's, no, I don't think anyone wants to be bored by that conversation, but I use the mean node in my practice, and they're basically the same form of measurement for the most part. And they're about to change signs again coming up in June. They'll shift from Cancer Capricorn to North Node in Gemini, South Node in Sagittarius.
Okay, so would you be able to give us like a little brief overview of what we might be expecting with this?
With the change of signs? Well, you're going from a Moon Saturn perspective to a Jupiter Mercury perspective. So it's always important to look at the rulers. And the Jupiter Mercury perspective has a lot to do with knowledge and wisdom, and almost like accepted societal values, belief systems, institutions, and dogmas. For example, the legal system, the governments, the ethics of institutions, or the way that things are organized societally through the courts. All that's Jupiter. So religion, education, law, government, all of those big Jupiterian things. Mercury, of course, throws things up in the air. Mercury scatters things, pulls things apart, analyzes, dissects, challenges, debates, brings in new questions. So it's going to be a time starting in June for, say, a good year and a half where, it's about paradigm. It's about questions about paradigm, which makes sense because if you think about it, we're moving and questioning and reorganizing, reconfiguring beliefs and structures, institutions and things like that, because we're moving out of a Moon Saturn period. And the Moon Saturn has more to do, for example, with death for one thing, and Moon Saturn, for example, the body and disease, sickness and health. It also has to do with inclusion versus exclusion, insiders versus outsiders, tribe versus foreigner. Those things have been a big deal for a couple of years now. And there's more that can be said for Cancer Capricorn, but a lot of it also has to do with just the potential for there to be, I mean, it's a heavier axis, I would say, in general, Cancer and Capricorn, because of the darkness versus light motif of the Moon and Saturn. That's a short explanation. I'm sorry to keep it really brief, but then you move into Sagittarius, Gemini, and they're masculine signs or they're yang signs. So they're much more active and outgoing. And then you got Jupiter, Mercury. So it's much more about mobilization of the mind, of intellectual questioning, debate, changes of policy, changes of vision. So it's coming, but it's coming right off from the raw more vulnerable experiences and difficulties, like a pandemic. That's a Moon Saturn kind of dynamic, right?
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm sure you'll do a more in-depth look at the nodes in Sagittarius and Gemini as well.
Yeah, we'll do probably a full couple of videos on that transition because it's a big one. It's hard to sum up really quickly.
Yeah, and the nodes themselves has been a massive topic. So thank you for sharing
Mm.
with us about that.
Yeah, you bet. I hope it was helpful. Thank you for just kind of guiding the discussion and taking up the questions and bringing them in for us. Um, in the meantime, check Kat out at thecreativeintrovert.com. She's got a cool podcast. And if you are interested in learning and studying more about these kinds of topics, you can check out my upcoming courses. Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic. My first year program starts in June. I also have a second year program and horary course. I have some videos about those. You can also check out in my library. And then any questions, feel free to email me, info@nightlightastrology.com. So we will hopefully see you guys again soon. Take it easy, everyone.